I am so excited to be here and super excited that we have a chance to get together 3 times after this as we begin this webinar series on equity in early childhood and how to address suspensions by viewing things through a racial equity lens. So today's workshop is on the historical roots of race in early childhood. It's so rare that we ever talk about how we got here. And today we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that. But first, I just want you to think about where you are in your career and how you learned about early childhood, how you learned how children grow and develop. And as you're thinking about that, some of us have been here a long time. I've been in this field since I was 21 years old. I am now going to be 62, so I've been here over 40 years. So when I think back on how did I learn about how children grow and develop, think about that. And as you're thinking, think about the theorists you studied. What theorists did you study in order to learn more about how children grow and develop? And if you don't mind, just take a minute and put a few of those theorists in the chat box. Who did you study? Piaget, Jean Piaget, absolutely. Erikson, Montessori. I see Vygotsky, Erikson, all of those theorists. Thank you so much. So here are a few that you mentioned. There's Erikson and Giselle, which was one of my favorites, Vygotsky, Piaget, Bronfenbrenner, absolutely. I know I did not include Maria Montessori or Magda Gerber, but those are other theorists. But as you even look at my list right here, what do they all have in common? What do most theorists have in common? All white men. And someone said all old white men. Most of them born in the 1800s. So we learned how children grow and develop based on what white men told us, with a sprinkling of white women. But how many of you have heard of these theorists and educators? How many of us learned from them? So if you've only learned child development from white men, I see someone's heard of Selena Butler, and we've never studied child development from a racial or cultural perspective, how might that influence what we believe we know about children? Exelora talked about the land that we stand on. And when we look at Indigenous people, they had children. They taught their children. They had theories about how children grow, learn, and develop. Have you ever studied it? The Latinx community, they have children. They have theories on how children grow, learn, and develop. Have we ever studied it? African Americans have children, and they had them during the 1800s when these people were prevalent, giving us all these theories. Did we ever think to study children from a cultural perspective? And why is it important that we do? I want you to go, this is a very interactive workshop. I should have warned you about that first. So I'm going to ask a lot of you, and I'm going to ask you to fully participate. So we're going to go into about 3 or 4 breakout groups today. They're not going to be very long until towards the end, but just for about 5 minutes, we're going to put you in the breakout group so that you can talk about why this is important. And you can also say, I never thought about it. This is what I was taught and I pretty much accepted it. So you're going to be in groups of about 5. That's going to give you 1 minute each. So we're going to go in for 5 minutes right now. And I just want you to think about why this is important and also how you learned about how children develop. Why is this important? Share only if you like. I just some basic ground rules. You have the right to share whatever you like, but you don't have to share. And what happens in the breakout group can stay there if you want. All right. Anyone like to share?
Could you hear me?
We can hear you, Anila. Is that correct?
Anila.
Did I say your name right?
Anila, yeah.
Anila.
Uh,
Okay.
yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Rosemary. It's been great privilege to have you and to hear you about this very, very significant topic. And I was sharing my experience in the classroom, that I belong to a country which is Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and I have been grew up in, um, you know, um, in a very tight atmosphere where majority of the population always imposed to minority. So Pakistan is a Muslim country, and me by faith is Christian. So I have very hard feeling, painful feelings since my childhood till my professional life. How Christians are being treated and on the basis of faith in Pakistan, and like for example, on Christmas I would like to take cake and to distribute in my class. I want to wear cross in my neck, but I could not because I know people around me is not welcoming. People around me is not accepting and making fun and tease and asking questions that make me uncomfortable. So I have gone through with the stages, and I know it's very important to share this important topic, whether it from the cultural perspective, race perspective, religion perspective, or socio-political perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate that. Anyone else? Did anyone study child development from a cultural perspective in terms of how children grow and develop? Okay, you have an assignment. I want you to just Google the precocity of Black children. That's all I'm going to tell you, because I'll guarantee you that these are things you did not learn in terms of how children grow and develop. And then the next time we get together, we will talk about that. And I just lost you. So let me see how I can share my screen. Oh, here we are. So it is important that we study children from multiple perspectives so that we get a full understanding of who they are. That is paramount to everything. When we think about women's studies in terms of gynecology, obstetrics, we were studied from a male perspective. Some of you may be old enough to remember, even during your monthly cycle, if anyone here has ever suffered from extreme cramps, that so many men never understood that, male doctors, and they would tell you that it's in your head or go home and take aspirin. You don't get a full understanding of people when you do not study them from their cultural biological perspective. When all you have to go on is what you have learned from a predominantly white male perspective. So that's very, very, very important. So what about early childhood studies? What about research around early childhood studies? We have 3 main studies that we look at. Can you all see my screen okay? Okay, and they are the Prairie Preschool Project, the Abecedarian, and the Chicago Child Study. These studies provide key research that highlights the importance and value of childcare to children, their families, and the communities. How many of you have heard of these studies? Just in the chat box really quickly, what do you know about some of these studies? Just tell me a little bit about what you know. Longitudinal studies studying children over time, yes. What else do we know? Yep, we use these studies to start programs such as Head Start because we know that that children benefit from these studies to track early learning and health outcomes, that they were taught by white middle class teachers. Prairie Preschool validated the positive impact of quality on early childhood education over a long period of time. Yes, 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 you are correct. But as with everything, especially since we have made a commitment, you have made a commitment to racial equity and addressing issues of inequity and race and oppression, we have to look at the background of what we say we believe. We cannot address racial equity or inequities unless we talk about race, but that's going to be a whole nother workshop. But today we're going to talk about race, and every one of our workshops will be talking about race. Yes, these studies were part of a dominant culture. They weren't very diverse, and they could make a big difference on children's learning. But let's look at our background here. To enact and sustain an anti-racist approach, as early childhood educators and professionals, we need to understand the racial history of early childhood programs and the racism that currently exists in our programs. And we don't like to talk about that because we are all here because we love children. And we're all here because we want to make a difference. But we have to understand the role of race and racism, even in early childhood programs. So when we look at the Prairie Preschool project, and that's the one we're going to focus on today, it was one of the first programs, the first longitudinal study that early childhood advocates, supporters, professionals, we really tout the benefits of this program, especially the cost benefit. We use this study to actually get money to increase our quality. And we tell investors and foundations that for every dollar they invest, there's a 13% return on that investment. So what we're saying is that we have the proof to show that high quality early childhood programs work. And guess what? They do. But let's look at the historical roots of this program and the others. The program provides key examples of the racial history of early childhood. The Prairie Preschool program was designed to increase the scores on IQ tests for children from so-called disadvantaged families. So the overall goal of the Prairie Preschool project was to address Black children's inherent deficits to create a better America. So let's look back on this inherent deficit statement that I just made. This program was initiated in the 1960s. Now think back, some of you lived through it, some of you were born right at the cusp of it, some of you studied it, but think back on what was taking place in the 1960s. Brown versus Board of Education, that decision was made to desegregate schools, and it hadn't been fully implemented yet. The Civil Rights Act hadn't even been signed yet. America was just filled with this climate of civil unrest, overt racism. Jim Crow laws were still in effect. During this time, my husband was about 10 or 11. He drank from white-only fountains, could not try on clothes when they went shopping for school clothes. So just think about that climate. And Black children were viewed as deprived culturally, socially, and economically. And people believed in this culture of poverty. We know better now, but those were the general beliefs during that time. And this is the time when this Prairie Preschool Research Project was initiated. And they called the children disadvantaged. We have to be very careful with our terminology. Back then, it was disadvantaged, culturally deprived. Today is at risk, and dare I say, trauma informed. So we want to watch the code language that we use to describe groups of people. But this term disadvantaged and the viewpoint now identified as a deficit perspective, it emerged around the time that this Prairie Preschool Project was initiated. And it was actually the code word for being poor and for being Black. So Black preschoolers were identified as a population that was broken, deficit, deprived, and they were identified as a population that needed to be fixed and whose deficits needed to be corrected so that their lives could be improved. So I want you to think about that for a minute. That if you view a group of people as deprived and broken that need to be fixed, who decides what's broken and who decides how to fix them? Not only were the children viewed as culturally deprived, but their families were as well, especially single Black mothers. They were viewed as pathological, as inept, and incapable of providing an optimal environment for their children. And this is really important for us to think about and talk about. When I talked about the precocity of Black children, I'll just give you a hint about what that's about. And it's about their overall development and how quickly Black children develop gross motor skills. And some of you may have learned this in your child development classes, that Black children, when they are born, they develop much faster in terms of gross motor skills than white children. And this is something that was never ever talked about, that so many Black children walk between 8 and 10 months. They sit up between 4 and 6 months. I mean, just amazing gross motor development. And here during the Prairie Preschool Project, they interviewed these Black moms and asked questions about, when did your child first sit up? Now, many of you learned that children sit up at what age? Just in the chat box. What did you learn in your child development class about when children sit up? And then tell me what you learned about when children stand and cruise around tables. And then at what age can we expect children to walk? You're right, 6 to 8 months. Carol says when they're ready. But most of the time we learn that children sit up between 6 and 8 months. So when these Black moms were telling these researchers that their babies sat up between 4 and 6 months, they thought they were lying and they changed their responses. And when they said, oh no, my babies start walking at 9 months of age, they go, there's no way, because we're taught that babies don't walk until 12 to 15 months. So they changed their answers. So this was this pathological piece where they really thought that the parents were trying to impress the researchers. Really, really important. And then there was this fear. Now remember, we're in the 60s, there's a lot of civil unrest, there's a lot of protest going on. So there was this fear of Black children, this fear that they were unruly and uneducated and socially deviant. And in order to address this issue, we have to develop programs and curricula to teach them how to behave, what are socially appropriate behaviors, and to teach them how to respond appropriately to authority. Imagine that. Imagine how these children were viewed, how Black people and brown people were viewed. And now developing a curricula based on that deficit point of view So not only do we have to look at the historical roots of the research projects, but also the historical roots of social emotional learning. Who decides what's appropriate behavior? You all have heard that I am a professor at the local university. And one of the things that I do, I have a class called the Cultural Socialization of Young Children. And this class is an 8-week intensive. And every week I take my students on field trips. I'd say 85% of them are middle class white women who have never been outside of their communities. So we go to a Muslim mosque, a Jewish temple, we go to a Buddhist temple, a Black church. And one of the most frightening for them is that we go to a neighborhood that has been deemed the most dangerous neighborhood in all of Colorado. And I take them there, I spring that on them the first day. The crying, the weeping, the wailing, I didn't bring my mace. My daddy told me never to go in that area, which is based on a lot of biases. But what we do, two of the most significant field trips are back to back. One is to a Buddhist temple. And when we go to this Buddhist temple, there's a part of the program where the minister calls all of the children to the front of the temple and gives a very short lesson for the day. And after the lesson, the minister asks the children if they have any questions. And you see the children raise their hands. They raise their hands. And the most amazing thing for me, the first time I saw this, was that minister called on every single child whose hand was raised and answered their question. And after that was over and no more hands were raised, he actually said, "Wow, do you have any other questions?" And he'd wait. And they said, "Well, seeing no more hands, you can go back to your parents." So that's the Buddhist temple. The following week, they go to the Black church. And I actually take them to my church. And my church is a hallelujah, thank you, Jesus, jump up and down church. Praise God, dance around, tambourines, call and response. You can actually talk when the pastor is talking. When you agree, you can say, "Preach, pastor." "Yeah, pastor, that's right." And you see babies pass from pew to pew all over the place. You see children jumping up and down and clapping. And then you see children going up to the altar being prayed for. So we take these two experiences, and when we go back to our classroom, we talk about behavioral expectations. And I ask my student, if you have children in your classroom who are from this Buddhist community, because people who go to church and go to church regularly, they just don't go on Sundays. They have Monday morning prayer study, Tuesday choir rehearsal, Thursday YPD, youth people, youth programs. I mean, they just live that life. So I said, if you had children from the Buddhist temple, what would your behavioral expectations be? And we talk about that. You could expect the children to sit down quietly. You could expect them to raise their hand. But what if you're one of those teachers who say what I've heard lots of teachers say when hands are raised? "Well, we're running out of time. I'm going to take one more question." Can you imagine the confusion of that child? "But my hand is raised." "But you didn't answer my question. I didn't get to ask it." They may be very confused if they're accustomed to having their questions answered if their hand is raised. But what about the Black church? And those children live that life of call and response and freedom. I remember that when my son was 2 at church, the mother of the church sat on one end of the pew and me and my son sat on the other, and he had the whole run of the pew. And she'd give him peppermint candy. He still talks about Black women with a purse full of peppermint candy, and I still carry it. But what are the behavioral expectations you would have of that child? I can bet you, let me grab a book, that if you are about to read a book, Helping Traumatized Children Learn, let's just pretend like this is Rebecca and the Purple Frog. And if you say, "Today I'm going to read a book about Rebecca and the Purple Frog," that child might say, "Teacher, I saw a purple frog. There was a purple frog in my breakfast cereal." And you say, "Okay, Jamal, that's great. Now let's read about Rebecca. My auntie's name is Rebecca, but they call her Becky." That child may be accustomed to this call and response and this interaction, but then viewed as being disruptive. But who is to say what's appropriate and what's not, based on whose experience? So I want you to be aware of that. Also, it was believed back then that Black families needed to be taught how to parent their children by the white teachers in the program. Does any name here surprise you? I have to tell you, I was surprised to find that Louise Derman Sparks, who wrote the first anti-bias curriculum book, was actually a teacher in the Prairie Preschool program and has given her perspective on some of the limitations of that study, which was really very interesting. So from the onset, the Prairie Preschool program, as well as the other projects of that time, coupled with the war on poverty, they sought to fix poor children. They saw them as broken. They sought to fix poor children, Black children, children of color, rather than to do what you all have made a commitment to do, and that's to address the structural racism that led to that condition. To address, okay, now I'm being bombarded with cuteness over here. I love it when I see children pop up on the screen. But they were more concerned with this deficit model of fixing children than addressing structural racism that led to the disproportionate number of Black children and poor children and being labeled deprived. So we cannot deny the positive outcomes of those projects. And there were positive outcomes. The Prairie Preschool Project resulted in positive outcomes for children, and it increased parent engagement over time. The children involved in that program have employment stability. And then we have seen these positive multi-generational effects. So the children who are involved in that program and their children have all become better in terms of employment and not going to jail and avoidance of teen pregnancies. And there's been positive adult health outcomes over time. So absolutely the program had positive outcomes, and we want to highlight that. But can you imagine what would the positive outcomes that could have occurred at a greater extent had that project approached these children and families from an asset-based lens? Now, one of the limitations of the research was that the researchers failed to interview teachers. They gathered no information about how they taught their relationship with the families, and they failed to also interview families about their experience with the program. They didn't investigate teachers' attitudes toward the children, nor the relationships between the home and schools. In Louise Derman Sparks, she talks about the things that they did to improve relationships and to work very closely with families. And this is a Rosemarieism, but I attribute that to the positive results. I attribute the teachers' interactions with families and how they taught that curriculum with the results and how things turned out. So today we're going to talk about how this information impacts how we observe and assess children. So how does this impact observations and assessments? We're going to talk about the deficit model and the anti-deficit model. So when we look at deficit model thinking, we pretty much see what we expect. So what do you expect? The deficit model focuses on the student and family as the major problem without examining the classroom environment or the instructional practices of the teacher. So here's a little guy here, and he's really upset. Actually, he looks like he's about to attack someone with a stick. And you can look at him and think, oh my goodness, here he goes again. Here he goes again, and you know what? His mom is a single mom. She works 2 jobs, and that's why he's behaving that way. And then you can look at this little guy here who just looks sad. He looks very sad, And you can blame the environment, the family, and say, well, he lives in poverty. His family doesn't have much. And here's a little one. She just got so angry. She wouldn't put herself in a corner and then let you know she was angry with you. And you can look at this behavior and you can say, well, her parents are going through a divorce right now. And that's probably her issue. But what if we really observe these children and really got to know them? What if we looked at our own practices in the classroom? We might find that we were really wrong after all. What if we looked at this little guy and we found out that he was actually falsely blamed for hitting again? Because there are children in our classrooms that we peg the troublemakers, and everything that goes wrong, we blame them. That's the child whose name is called all the time. For me, and I taught 3-year-olds forever, it was Connor. Connor, stop. Connor, don't. Connor, what are you doing? Connor, did you do that? Connor, don't make me have to come over there and get you. Connor, sit in my lap during circle time. How many of you have a Connor? We've all had them. I remember when I heard a ruckus in the block area, and I was standing a little ways away, and I said, what's happening over there? And one of my little girls said, teacher, it's Connor. And I looked around, and then I had to realize that Connor wasn't even there that day. But I had taught the children in my class that Connor was the troublemaker. Yes. So here's Connor. He was blamed for hitting, but he didn't do it. And that's why he's so mad. And here's this little guy who is so sad. Would you be surprised to know that he wasn't allowed to finish his lunch? How many of you work in school districts and where your preschool is in a school district? Do you know how short the lunch period is? Have any of you ever visited a school lunch period? Like 12 minutes? And you go, 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 eat. Time's up. Let's go. How many of you are slow eaters? Oh my goodness, my sister Pam, she's the slowest eater known to mankind. By the time you're done, she's just starting. But you can't not rush slow eaters. It makes them go slower. So how badly does a child feel, and how hungry must they be if they're a slow eater and they couldn't finish their lunch? Someone said sometimes they can't even reach the table. For some of you, 10 minutes for the school district. Anybody a social eater? I just can't sit down and eat by myself and enjoy food. I want to sit with you. I want to talk. I want to taste what you have. This is so good. Try mine. Dig your fork in here. Of course, with COVID, we can't do any of that. But this little guy wasn't allowed to finish his lunch. And he's so sad, and he's hungry, and he's lethargic. And what about this one? Maybe it's not because her parents are going through a divorce, but perhaps you told her that she would get a turn on the bike in 3 minutes and you forgot. And she was waiting and waiting and waiting, and she never got a turn, and she got upset. So when we are knee deep in deficit model thinking, then we don't examine our own practices. So we have to be willing to step out of the blame game, to step away from the deficit model, and really encourage and see children through an asset-based lens. So this cultural deficit model, it's used to explain the so-called achievement gap, and we blame students, we blame their families, we blame their communities. So it starts with blaming the victim, and then it's based on stereotypes and assumptions. It fails to address the problems in our own classrooms. It absolves us from any responsibility, and then it shifts all the responsibility to children and their families. There are some assumptions around this cultural deficit model. People believe that students of color, children of color, fail because of cultural deprivation. They lack exposure to cultural models that's aligned with school success. They're being fixed and it's not working. They enter with a lack of cultural capital. They come from disadvantaged families. They don't value education, or the families are not involved. But none of this is true. The facts are that Latino parents are highly involved in ensuring the academic success of their children. African American families have a high level of participation when programs emphasize outreach and community resources. Because you put an invitation or a flyer on the door saying that we're going to have this program next week, doesn't mean that that's an invitation for families of color. You have to know how to reach out to families in a way that they're receptive. There are entire schools that serve these so-called deprived students that are doing very, very, very well. Sometimes even better than affluent schools. So some of the alternatives to deficit model thinking is to tap into the cultural knowledge, the funds of knowledge the children bring with them. And that's evident in their communities, which means you have to show up. Some of you work in communities that you are uncomfortable teaching in. Some of you work in communities where you fear the families. You cannot teach and be effective working in a community that you fear. Please know that, because the people that you're fearing are the uncles and aunties and cousins of the children you serve. So tap into the cultural wealth of the community. Become familiar with the culture that the children bring with them. Recognize your position of privilege and the power dynamic and how that impacts your classroom, and understand the social capital the children bring with them and implement culturally responsive practices. You can also use the anti-deficit approach. And this approach was created by a group of researchers that ask, how are children succeeding rather than how children are failing? So rather than use negative information on why children are failing, ask how they succeeded. Let me just bring that home a little bit. Rather than saying, what is this child's ACEs scores based on negative and adverse childhood experiences, ask what their resilience score is and how they and their family succeeded. You see the shift and the difference? And then rely on information and research that shows resiliency and how families of color succeed, and then identify factors based on children's success. So you can reframe your way of thinking. Rather than what challenges you're having, tell me your successes. Tell me how you got here. Tell me your hopes, dreams, and aspirations for your children. So I want you to think about how you can reframe using this anti-deficit approach. I want you to be aware of bias in assessments. And sometimes the bias is there, most times, and you're not aware of it. There are different types of biases that are evident in our classrooms. There's racial bias, stereotyping, exclusion and isolation of various groups, linguistic bias, and cosmetic bias. We don't always talk about the cosmetic bias or the linguistic bias. Let's just go over this just a little bit. So first, the stereotypes. Stereotypes lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. They are gross generalizations regarding groups of people, and you categorize people attributing inflexible characteristics. And they are always, always dangerous. So what does that mean? That means that the gross generalization, I'll give you my own experience. There's a gross generalization that Black people steal. I went to a a department store here in Colorado a few years ago, and it was a huge sale. It was a 75% off the clearance price. So those of you who are shoppers, you know that's a big sale. I got cash because I did not want my husband to know how much money I was spending. So I went and got cash. I'm at this store. I'm looking around like, where do I start? So I started with me in the women's section, and I am shopping, shopping, shopping. I am just, my arms are heavy with clothes. And then I saw a tank top that I really loved, and I already had one. And it just so happened that I had one on. So, but I wanted more, but I couldn't remember what size I got. And those of you who go between sizes, you know what that's like. So I'm on my way to the dressing room, and I turned around and there's a woman behind me. And I said, oh, I'm gonna buy more tank tops like the one I have on. Do you mind looking at my tag to tell me what size this is so I don't have to go through the trouble of getting undressed?" And she goes, "Sure." And she looked at the tag, she told me. So I went back out and I bought one of those in every color. Arm is full, arm is heavy. I decided, let me go pay for these things before I go up to the children's section to buy things for my kids. So I paid for it, $75.58, paid cash, left, went upstairs. And then when I went up, I saw that same lady and I kind of waved and she looked at me kind of strange. And I thought, oh, that's odd. And I'm just shopping now for my kids. I'm shopping for the kids. Didn't get as much, arms not as heavy, but I thought, okay, pay for this. And I thought, oh, before you pay for it, maybe I shouldn't go home without buying something for my husband. So I take the escalator down and I'm looking for something for my husband and I'm looking at the rack. This arm is full. I'm looking. And as I push the clothes over, there's that woman. And then it occurred to me, she's following me. She wasn't just so friendly. Everywhere I was, she was. Now, we're going to talk about microaggressions later in this series, but usually the meltdown you see is a culmination of many, 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 many incidents. And that went through me. I was just outdone. I'm not a yeller, but I can be very emphatic. And I said, come back here. And she came, to my surprise. I said, you are following me. No, no, no. I said, yes, you are. Yes, you are. You followed me into the dressing room. You followed me up to the children's section. Now you're following me down here. What I don't understand is why you didn't stop when I paid for my clothes. Here, I have my bag. And she goes, no, no, no. And I said, you follow me right now. You follow me back up to the women's department so I can get a refund for everything I just bought from this store. And to my surprise, again, she followed me up there. And I am mad. And I said, I want my money back. I want it back right now. And the lady says, well, I don't have enough cash. Yes, you do, because I just gave you $74.58. You give me my money back right now because I spent too much money here to be followed. I am not going to have this. And I am just emphatic. And then there's a Latina woman standing right near me. She goes, they follow me too. They follow me too. And before you know it, there's this crowd around. And the manager came over and, what can I help you? And I said, I'm not going to be treated this way. And they gave me that money really, really fast. And I was so mad. And I went downstairs and I stormed out of the door. Some of you who have heard me speak before, you know, I have sensory integration processing issues. So when I went out the door, I got out and I'm like, I went out the wrong door. I don't know where I am. I have to go back in. But I share that with you so you can see the stereotypes. They lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. That woman saw me as a thief. And she followed me all over the store, even though she saw me pay for my merchandise. She still could not believe that I wasn't going to steal. So it led to the self-fulfilling prophecy. And then you know what happened to me? Now, people who had no idea of what was going on, they only saw another stereotype, the mad Black woman, the angry Black woman. And it's like, now I fulfilled this stereotype trying to fight another one. So that's why stereotypes are always, always, always damaging. Now, when we talk about bias, racial bias, it could be implicit and explicit. I'm not going to go into that right now because we're going to have a whole session on implicit bias. But this is a level of bias that we hardly ever talk about, and it's cosmetic bias. Do you know that we love cute kids? Cute children get away with murder. My dog was acting up when my son was little. She was just something else. And I remember my son saying, you wouldn't get away with that if you weren't so cute. And it reminded me of cosmetic bias. Cute children get away with a lot, but not children that we find unattractive, not the one with green clogged up snot coming out of their nose, whose face hadn't been washed, whose hair hadn't been brushed. Maybe their teeth weren't brushed. They don't get away with a lot. Dark-skinned children don't get away with a lot. There's an attractiveness and cosmetic bias. And we do it all the time. How many of you look at TV and wonder, why didn't she wear braces? Why didn't she get her hair fixed? Why don't they fix their teeth? Oh, she could use a nose job. We are guided by that. We have bias in terms of looks, and it impacts how we see children. And then this linguistic bias. Do you know there are still children today who are told not to speak their native language in our schools? Today, we speak English here. You'll never learn English if you keep speaking Spanish. There are people right here in this meeting who are afraid to speak their native tongue right now in public for fear of being attacked. And not only does linguistic bias include other languages, it includes other dialects. So, what about African American vernacular English? I'm finna go to the store. I'm finna do it. How many of you? There's no such word as finna. In that child's family, it is. In that child's family, it is. Or where's your partner? She gone. Do you mean she's gone? No, she gone. In that child's family, that's okay. Are those who mix two languages together. So we have this linguistic bias against children based on how they speak and the languages that they speak. And then there's this bias of isolation or exclusions of groups of children. When I was observing classrooms, I had teachers break down and cry when I had to point out to them that there were children in their classroom that they did not speak to the entire day. Doesn't that seem impossible? That you could have 20 children in your classroom and there were some that you never, ever said a single word to. I saw it regularly. And I have to qualify that because most of the children who were excluded were usually those who were not a problem and very flexible. You know, when you talk about those three temperaments, the feisty, the fearful, or the flexible, flexible children in our classroom environments don't get much attention. It's usually the feisty ones, those louder ones, the ones that we have deemed a behavioral problem. And they get a lot of attention, but it's not positive attention. So we want to be aware of that. So those are some of the biases that show up in our assessment process. And I know some questions are popping up and we're going to have a question and answer period in about 15 minutes. But before we do that, I'm going to give you a practical exercise to engage in. You're actually going to watch a child and you're going to write an observation as a group. Now, just a refresher, you all remember how you write observations. Most of us were taught how to do this. You write down what you see and you avoid subjective language. So I just want you to take a few minutes and write down what you see with this child. But I want to tell you a little bit about this child. And this is actually a child that I observed. One of my student teachers was working with a master teacher in an underserved community here in Denver. And about the fourth week of classes, she came in, she goes, Rosemarie, we have this kid who is just unbelievable. His behavior is the worst I've ever seen. I have no idea what to do with him. And I'm just at my wit's end because he is destructive, he's belligerent, he hurts other children, he destroys property. And she went on and on and on. And I said, well, did you talk to your master teacher? And she said, yes, but my master teacher said, if you're so smart, you come in and show us how to do it. So I ended up going to this classroom to observe this child. Now, for those of you who have called people like me into your classrooms to observe, true confessions. We know that when we show up, there's a little fairy that shows up and it flies around this child and it releases this pixie dust that says, you're being watched, you better behave. So we know that that fairy has distributed this pixie dust and the behaviors that we're there to see, we may not see. We know that. And that is why I spend an entire day from opening to closing one day and then half the next day, because that pixie dust dissolves after an hour or two so that I can really see the child's behavior. So I want to tell you that. So, But before I observe, I like to get an idea of how the teachers perceive the child. So I met with them and I said, tell me what this child loves to do. And they looked at me like I was nuts. Like, we're not here to talk about what he loves to do. And I said, just tell me his interest. They couldn't tell me a single interest this child had. And I said, okay, that's okay. I understand he's overwhelming. I said, well, tell me what he does when he's not engaging in these behaviors that you described. What is he doing? They couldn't tell me. And I said, well, surely he's not hitting children and destroying property the entire time. So when he's not doing that, just try to think back on your daily routine. Then what is he doing? They came up with 2 things: eating or sleeping, or 3, eating, sleeping, or toileting. Toileting was iffy because they could never let him go in by himself or with people. Teacher had to escort him at all times. So this is the child that you are going to observe right now. And he is the one, oh, I'm sorry, that is not the one I want. Yes, we'll do this one first. Oh, wait a minute. I did that all wrong. You have to, oh no, I did it right. You're gonna watch this child and then you're gonna go in and write the observation. Is that okay? All righty, let me start it over again. Again, he is the child with the blue shirt on. Feel free to take a few notes now so you'll remember when you go into your group.
Like that.
Okay. There's not a way for me to show this to you while in your group, so you're going to have to use your memory, but you're going to go back into the same groups you were in. You're going to have 10 minutes to write an observation of what you saw here. You ready? Okay, here we go. I'll see you in about 10 minutes. Funny when you're dragged back into the group and you're still talking and you come in talking. That was fast and it wasn't quite 10 minutes because I didn't realize that we only have 10 minutes left in the workshop. But how many of you, just tell me what you saw in the recording. What did you saw? What did you see with these 2 children that you were able to jot down a little bit?
So there was 2 boys on the carpet using geometric shapes to put, one was actually doing the hands-on putting the shapes together. And the other one was, in my first initial response, was more of a cheerleader on. He was excited about when the blocks were being put into place by his peer. but I really couldn't make out what he was saying in our small group. Others heard him saying, the one boy telling the one that was more of an observer to hold on. But I couldn't really make out what they were saying when I watched it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Graciela. So, and I love that you put this in the chat box. You have two children playing on the floor and close proximity. One was placing the tiles to make a design. The second child was watching and encouraging. Did anyone see him talking about colors? Orange, blue. But this is a child who only engages in positive things when he's sleeping or eating and sometimes toileting. So now I want you to see, just for your information, when I showed this clip and many others, I collected about 20 clips like this the day and a half that I was there. Both teachers cried. And both of them said they had never seen him engage in this kind of behavior. And you know what? I believe them. I absolutely believe that they'd never seen it. Let me show you this clip. We won't have time to go into small groups, but I'll show you this and we'll talk about it for a couple of minutes. Oh, wait. You can't see it yet, can you? Hold on. Remember, he's in the blue. Okay, and then I stopped that one because you can only observe so much before you have to stop harmful behavior. Oops, sorry. What did you see? Well, let me ask the direct question. Who started the fight?
It appeared to be other child to me.
Not the child in the blue, the stripy child, the other child, not the child in the blue. But when this fight happened, now I'll tell you, the child in the blue did not start the fight. Does everyone agree? Did you see that? But when it happened, I have to tell you, he finished the fight. He didn't start it, but he definitely finished it. And all the teachers in the classroom came running over. And who do you think was blamed? The child in the blue. See, this is what we're talking about. Did you see him? Did you see him hurt this child? And blah, blah, blah. And you all know, those of you who are observers here, you know that as an observer, you're supposed to be neutral. I broke the rule because I said I was standing right here and he did not start that fight. So why do I say I believe the teachers when they said that they don't ever see him engage in those positive reactions? And someone put it in the chat box, they don't look for it. They don't see it. And they only pay attention to him when he is engaged in negative behaviors. That's all they see. And some of that is part of that confirmation bias. Have you ever bought a cobalt blue car and all of a sudden all cobalt blue cars are on the road? That's all you see. This is what happens. They only see what they're looking for. And we have to be very, very, very careful of that when we are observing children. I'm sorry, I'm not going to go back to my slides. Let me end the show because the last slide just says, everything that I talked to you about is predicated on relationships. When you have relationships that are positive and nurturing with children and their families, it totally eliminates bias and preferential treatment and everything else that, I'm sorry, I have a puppy. I'm wondering, what did he just get into? And everything else that leads to disproportionality and opportunity gaps in our classroom and in our classroom practices. So we talked about a lot. We talked about theorists. We talked about the historical roots of racism in our research. We talked about bias and assessments. And then we had a little practice in looking at and engaging in assessments. So as we bring this session to an end, what questions do you have? I know some of you have written them in the chat box, and Jess, do you have some for me? And you can continue to add them to the chat box, or it's okay with me if you decide to unmute to ask as well.
I have a question. What
Yeah.
would be the first book you would recommend for me to read?
I think the first book that I would recommend on this journey to racial equity is called Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. It's a really good introductory book to learn about racial equity and what it looks like and the journey of getting there. I see that Margaret says, out of curiosity, were the teachers, and I'm thinking, Margaret, that you're talking about the teachers in the little boy's classroom, were they Black or white? They were Black. One Black and one white. My student was white, the teacher was Black. When we talk about implicit bias, which is our next session, I believe, we're going to talk about implicit bias and how none of us are immune, how it impacts every one of us. Nothing we ask for, something we inherited, but it impacts everyone. What other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this useful video. This is something that we are facing every day in our house, and particularly in school. It's hard to decide. For example, in my break room, my observation was that the blue boy was very controlling. And now I feel guilty of that observation after looking to the real video and your explanation. So my question is this, that, if this kind of situation occur, how should we decide and how should we behave immediately, so that we can stop the fight, and then we decide accordingly, because we are hurting feeling of kid very frequently.
Mhm. It's so interesting.
Don't
Thank you so
trust.
much. That is an excellent question. I'm going to give you the long answer in a short period of time. The way that we're taught in early childhood is when you see harmful interactions, especially fights, that you go in, you stop the harm, and then you teach children in that moment. We use our words, use your words. How many of you were taught that? What we found was that does very little to give children the tools to resolve conflicts. So you get fight after fight after fight after fight, because what we're doing is focusing on the fight and giving short-term strategies rather than teaching children how to resolve conflict. So what I teach my students are the 6 steps to conflict resolution, and I will send this to Exaloria and to Jess so that she can send it out to you if you're interested. And I tell my students to not pay any attention at all to the fight itself. You go in, you stop the harmful interactions, but rather than focusing on the symptom, which is the fight, let's go and focus on the cause. So you go in, step 1, stop the harmful interaction. Step 2 is to ask children what happened. We always assume we know. We see what we see, and then we assume that to be true. So, and it's not. So when you ask children, first, I'm sorry, you step in, you ask them what's going on. I'm going too fast, let me slow down. You label their feelings. Exaloria, I see that you're upset. Jess, you're upset. What is going on? He took my Spider-Man action figure and I want it back. Exaloria, but you said I could play with it. But it's mine and I brought it from home. And then after you get this information, you restate it. Exaloria, you want to play with the Spider-Man action figure. Jess, you brought it from home and you want it back. And then you state the obvious. Hey, guess what, guys? We have a problem because Exaloria wants to play with it and Jess wants it back. How are we going to solve this? You're teaching children problem solving skills. How are we going to solve it? I want it, but you said I could play with it, but I want it back now. Exaloria, you want it now. Jess, you want it now. We have to solve this problem. When you first start doing this, the children are going to look at you like you're crazy, because typically we'd say, go put that in your cubby. You shouldn't have brought it from home. Or if it belongs to the school, if you can't share it, I'll put it away. And the children never get the opportunity to problem solve. So if you start doing this right away, you might have to ask this question. I have an idea. Would you like to hear it? How about if Exaloria Exceloria plays with it for 5 minutes, and then she'll give it back to you, Jess, in 5 minutes. Will that work? Most of the time they'll say yes. And you're modeling problem solving. So what you're doing is teaching them how to solve a problem. And I promise you, if you do that for a year, by 75%, your aggression in your classroom will decrease. It will decrease by 75%. Because what I've seen in my classrooms is this: children are fighting over a toy, they stop, they go, we have a problem and we need to solve it. The children start. Now, it did backfire on me with 2 little girls. One of them said, I have a problem. We have a problem when we need to solve it. And the other little girl said, you have a problem. I don't have a problem. You go solve your problem by yourself. And that's the first time I had that happen. But I'll send you those steps. It is approached by the high school curriculum. And if you, I'll just send you the links and I'll send you a handout on how to do it. But Anila, that has really helped me. And you don't have the burden of trying to figure out who's wrong. But you use that example, you use that opportunity to teach. That's hard if you have a value that fighting should have harsh consequences. If you think discipline should be harsh and not a learning opportunity, then that's where the kind of conflict will come in.
Thank you. But most of the time, kids lie, and it's very hard for a teacher to evaluate the exact situation to whom she should or he should trust on, especially when they become toddler or in kindergarten. It's very hard because they lie based on their experience, based on their reading practices and the environment of the house. And if they are cute, as you said, the stereotypical thing, or the cosmetic biasness, then always the cute kids got the number, and the not great looking kid always be on the false side.
Yes. And Anila, I'm going to challenge you here to I know sometimes children will say things based on their perspective, and they're 2 and 3. But even if this one said I brought it from home and this one said I didn't, the fight isn't over who brought it from home. So even if that's not true, the point is to help them to solve the problem. You don't have to get to who it belongs to, because they're not fighting over who it belongs to. They're fighting over the fact that they both want to play with it. So what I would suggest is, even if you know that it belongs to another child and they brought it from home, stay focused. This is the thing. So many times when we're interacting with children, especially when it's in disciplinary situations, we lose our focus. Anybody here have teenagers or tweens? This is what happens. So I'm looking at Alan. Alan, I'm going to just pretend I'm making stuff up about you and your kids. Alan has a son and he has a daughter. And the son wants to go to a party, but he needed to go pick up his room. He needed to clean it up. And his friends come to pick him up. He's ready to go to the party. And Alan says, dude, did you clean your room? He goes, no, but my friends are here. I got to go. He goes, you're not going anywhere until you clean up your room like we agreed. And then he goes, you know what? You don't do this to my sister. My sister, she already left for the party, and you love my sister more than me, and you're always on me and you're never on her. If Alan's not careful, all of a sudden he'll go down this rabbit hole about who he loves. But if you stay clear, hey, dude, we're not talking about your sister. Go clean your room. But the party's going to be over, and you just want me to miss the party. That's why I can't ever have fun. And you're so old, you never had fun as a kid, and that's why you're trying to deprive me. You can really get offended by that. Are you calling me old? Let me tell you something about being old. Don't go there. Dude, room, then party. It is so hard for us to stay focused on what it is we want. And all of a sudden we're having an argument with a 4-year-old that isn't even about what you asked them to do, and that was put the blocks away. All of a sudden you're reassuring him and talking about this, and don't you dare call me fat butt, because that's rude. Even when they say, that's why I don't like you, teacher, with your fat butt. You can say, you don't call me fat butt because that's not okay. That's not the point. I need you to pick up your blocks. You're the grown up. Fat butt, fat butt. You can go out when you pick up your blocks. Fat butt, fat. When you pick up your blocks, you can go out, but it takes real maturity not to go down that rabbit hole. Does that make sense? So Anila, I'm going to ask you to When you're in these situations, try to focus on the problem at hand, not to try to determine the child's motivation, because I'll tell you what, 75% of the time you're wrong. Because we translate our own adult feelings and put them on children, and we can be so far off.
Thank you. That helps.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Are we over time? Oh, kind of.
Yeah, we're at 10:35. So yes, we're over time. And there weren't any questions in the chat box. If maybe folks do have some follow-up questions, you can email me and let me know. And I can get those to Dr. Allen. So, but right now, lots of thank yous, Dr. Allen.
Thank you.
So,
All right, well,
okay.
I appreciate you all, and I hope to see you at the next session. I believe that's on implicit bias and
I
microaggressions.
think so.
All righty, well, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for your time and spending the mornings, sharing your morning with me.
All right. Good to see everybody. Thank you.